Find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and allow yourself to settle into this quiet space. Tonight, we journey back over 2,000 years to ancient Rome to explore one of the most fascinating and mysterious deities in the Roman pantheon. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings, endings, transitions, and time itself. As we enter the first month of our modern year, we walk in the footsteps of the ancient Romans, who named this month Januarius in honor of Janus. The Romans believed that Janus stood at the threshold of the old year and the new, looking backward to what had passed and forward to what was yet to come. In this way, he embodied the very essence of January, a time of reflection and renewal. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we step through the doorway of time, back to the ancient world where Janus held a unique and powerful position among the gods. Janus was unlike any other deity in the Roman pantheon. While gods like Jupiter, Mars, and Venus had their counterparts in Greek mythology, Janus was distinctly Roman, with no Greek equivalent. This made him special, indigenous to Roman religious thought, emerging from the earliest layers of their spiritual tradition. The most striking feature of Janus was his appearance. He was depicted with two faces looking in opposite directions. This wasn't meant to be monstrous or frightening, but rather symbolically profound. One face looked to the past, the other to the future. One face gazed upon what was behind, the other upon what lay ahead. In Latin, he was sometimes called Janus bifrons, meaning Janus of two faces, or Janus Geminus, twin Janus. Some ancient sources describe Janus as having four faces, able to see in all four cardinal directions. These representations, known as Janus quadrifrons, were less common but appeared in certain temples and on some coins. Whether depicted with two faces or four, Janus was always shown as a mature, bearded man, dignified and solemn, befitting his ancient status among the gods. The Romans believed Janus possessed knowledge that other gods did not. Because he could see both past and future simultaneously, he understood the flow of time in a way that made him immensely wise. He knew what had been and what would be, standing perpetually at the meeting point of these two realms. Above all else, Janus was the god of beginnings. The Latin word for door is iannua, and it shares its root with the god's name. Janus presided over doorways, gateways, and arches, those liminal spaces between inside and outside, between one place and another. But his domain extended far beyond physical doors. Janus governed all forms of transition and commencement. He was invoked at the beginning of every day, for each day was a new beginning. He was called upon at the start of every month as the calendar turned its page. He watched over the beginning of every important undertaking, whether it was planting crops, starting a journey, going to war, or beginning a business venture. In Roman religious practice, Janus held a position of primacy. When the Romans made sacrifices to the gods, Janus was always invoked first, even before Jupiter, the king of the gods. This wasn't because Janus was more powerful than Jupiter, but because he was the god of beginnings, and every ritual, every prayer, every ceremony was itself a beginning that required his blessing. The poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, recorded a conversation he claimed to have had with Janus in his work Fasti, a poetic calendar of Roman festivals. In this literary dialogue, Janus explains that he is called upon first because he guards the threshold, and one must pass through the door before entering the house. Only after Janus opened the way could prayers reach the other gods. This principle of priority extended throughout Roman life. When Romans greeted each other in the morning, they would often invoke Janus. When they left their homes, they would honor him. The doorway of a Roman house was sacred space protected by Janus, and many Romans would perform small rituals at their thresholds to ensure his blessing. In the Roman Forum, the heart of ancient Rome's civic life, stood one of the most unusual temples in the entire city. The Temple of Janus was not like other temples. It was relatively small, more of a covered passageway than a grand structure. Ancient sources describe it as having doors at both ends, and within stood a statue of Janus with his two faces. What made this temple extraordinary was its function as a barometer of peace and war. According to Roman tradition, when Rome was at war, the doors of this temple stood open. When Rome was at peace, the doors were ceremonially closed. The open doors symbolized that Janus had released Mars, the god of war, to go forth. They also represented Rome itself being open to the return of its soldiers, a passageway for them to come home. The closing of these doors was a rare and momentous occasion. According to the historian Livy, from the time of Rome's legendary second king, Numa Pompilius, who reigned around 700 years before the Common Era, until the reign of Augustus, the doors had been closed only twice. This speaks to the reality of Rome's history as a civilization almost constantly engaged in military conflict or expansion. Augustus himself, Rome's first emperor, took great pride in closing the doors of the Temple of Janus 3 times during his reign. This was an achievement he celebrated in his official autobiography, the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, which was inscribed on bronze pillars. For Augustus, closing the temple doors symbolized the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which he claimed to have brought to the Mediterranean world after decades of civil war. The ritual of opening and closing these doors continued for centuries, a unique practice that connected the god of beginnings with Rome's military fortunes and its relationship with peace and conflict. The connection between Janus and time extended most famously to the Roman calendar. The month of January, which began the Roman year, bore his name. Januarius was the month of Janus, the gateway to the new year. However, this wasn't always the case. In the earliest Roman calendar, attributed to Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, the year began in March and contained only 10 months. January and February didn't exist. It was Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, who reformed the calendar around the 7th century before the Common Era, adding January and February. Even after this reform, for many years the Roman civic year still began in March. The influence of this older system can still be seen in our month names. September, October, November, and December derive from the Latin words for 7, 8, 9, and 10. Yet they are our 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th months. This is because they were originally the 7th through 10th months when the year began in March. It wasn't until 153 before the Common Era that the Roman Senate officially moved the beginning of the civil and political year to January 1st. From that point forward, January 1st became the day when new consuls took office, marking it as a day of political as well as calendrical renewal. The Romans celebrated the calends of January, the first day of the month, with particular reverence. This was a day sacred to Janus, and people would exchange gifts, often of dates, figs and honey, accompanied by good wishes for the coming year. These gifts were called strene, and they were thought to ensure that the year would be sweet and prosperous. On this day, Romans would also give coins stamped with the image of Janus. Many Roman coins featured Janus, and numismatists have catalogued hundreds of different types of Janiform coins from throughout Roman history. On these coins, Janus typically appeared with his two faces in profile, one looking left and one looking right, capturing perfectly his nature as the god who looks both ways. The Romans understood that Janus governed not just the beginning of the year, but all cycles of time. He was associated with the seasons, with the waxing and waning of the moon, with sunrise and sunset. Any moment of transition fell under his watchful gaze. The mythology surrounding Janus was as unique as the god himself. Unlike many Roman deities who had elaborate mythological narratives borrowed from Greek sources, Janus's stories were distinctly Roman and relatively sparse, befitting his nature as an ancient, primal deity. One tradition held that Janus was not originally a god at all, but rather a king who ruled over Latium, the region around Rome, in the distant mythological past. According to this legend, Janus welcomed Saturn to Italy when that god was fleeing from his son Jupiter. In gratitude, Saturn shared with Janus the gift of seeing both past and future, which manifested in his two faces. After his death, Janus was deified and became the god of beginnings. This tradition placed Janus at the very foundation of Italian civilization, making him not just ancient, but primordial, a figure from the age before the Olympian gods established their reign. Some Roman scholars interpreted Janus as representing the original chaos from which the ordered world emerged, the moment of creation itself. Another myth connected Janus with the protection of Rome. During the reign of Romulus, when Rome was at war with the Sabines after the famous incident of the rape of the Sabine women, the Sabines nearly captured Rome. They had bribed Tarpeia, a Roman maiden, to open one of the city gates. As the Sabine forces poured through, disaster seemed certain. At this critical moment, Janus intervened. He caused a hot spring to erupt from the ground near his sacred grove, scalding the advancing Sabine warriors and forcing them to retreat. This allowed the Romans to regroup and eventually negotiate peace with the Sabines. In gratitude, the Romans decreed that the gates of Janus's temple would remain open during wartime, symbolically keeping the god ready to defend Rome whenever needed. Ovid's Fasti contains the most extensive collection of Janus myths. In this work, Janus himself speaks, explaining his origins and nature. He describes himself as the ancient one who existed before the other gods, when the universe was chaos. He claims to have been present at the moment of creation, witnessing the separation of the elements and the formation of the cosmos. In Ovid's account, Janus explains that the ancients called him Chaos. He describes himself as formless air and the elements of water, fire and earth all mingled together. Then, through divine power, these elements separated and the ordered world came into being. Because he witnessed this transformation from chaos to cosmos, from non-being to being, he became the god of beginnings and transitions. The worship of Janus permeated Roman religious life in ways both grand and intimate. As we've mentioned, he was invoked first in any sacrifice or prayer, but his presence extended into countless other aspects of Roman spirituality. the Sali, an ancient priesthood dedicated to Mars, would begin their ritual processions and war dances with hymns to Janus. These priests, whose traditions stretched back to the earliest days of Rome, recognized Janus as the gateway through which Mars himself must pass. Private household religion also honored Janus. Roman homes typically had a shrine called a lararium, where the family would make offerings to their household gods, the Lares and Penates. But before invoking these domestic deities, the head of the household would honor Janus, acknowledging him as the guardian of the doorway and the threshold between the public world and the private space of the home. The Portunalia, a festival celebrated on August 17th, honored Portunus, a god closely associated with Janus. Portunus was a deity of harbors and ports, and his connection to Janus came through their shared association with doorways and gateways. A port, after all, is a gateway between land and sea, another form of threshold over which Janus held sway. But the most important festival dedicated to Janus was celebrated on January 9th, though some sources place it on January 1st itself. This festival, called the Agonalia, or the Festival of Janus Agonalis, involved the sacrifice of a ram. The exact meaning of Agonalis is debated by scholars. Some suggest it relates to the Latin word for lamb, agnus, while others connect it to agonia, relating to sacrifice or struggle. During this and other festivals, cakes called iannuae would be prepared. These special breads or cakes were made in the shape of doors or gateways, physically embodying the god's nature. They would be offered at his shrines or shared among family members as a way of invoking his blessing. The Romans had numerous epithets for Janus, each highlighting a different aspect of his nature. He was called Janus Pater, Father Janus, emphasizing his ancient paternal status among the gods. He was Janus Matutinus, relating to his association with morning and new beginnings. He was Janus Quirinus, connecting him to Quirinus, the deified form of Romulus. And he was Janus Geminus, twin Janus, referring to his double-faced nature. Beyond the famous Temple of Janus in the Roman Forum, several other sacred sites were dedicated to this god throughout Rome and the broader Roman world. The Janiculum Hill, one of the hills overlooking Rome from the western side of the Tiber River, bore a name associated with Janus. Ancient tradition held that this hill was the site of Janus's ancient citadel, when he ruled as a king in the mythological past. From this high ground, Janus could look in all directions, watching over his domain, just as his two faces allowed him to see in multiple directions simultaneously. Near the Janiculum, there was said to be a grove sacred to Janus, one of the oldest religious sites in the region. Roman writers described this grove as existing from time immemorial, a place where the earliest inhabitants of Italy had worshipped long before Rome was founded. In the Roman Forum itself, in addition to the Temple of Janus, there was an archway known as the Janus Geminus, or Arch of Janus. This structure, essentially a covered passage with gates at each end, embodied Janus's nature as a god of transitions and passages. People walking through the Forum would pass through this arch, symbolically passing under the protection of Janus. Archaeological evidence has revealed numerous smaller shrines and inscriptions dedicated to Janus throughout the Roman Empire. These range from elaborate public monuments to simple household shrines. Some of the most interesting examples come from military contexts, where soldiers invoked Janus at the beginning of campaigns or when passing through the gates of military camps. In the city of Rome, there were at least 7 official sanctuaries or shrines to Janus, though only fragmentary remains of most of these have been identified by archaeologists. The multiplicity of these sites speaks to his importance in Roman religious life, and to the different aspects of his nature that were honoured at different locations. The artistic representations of Janus are among the most distinctive in all of Roman art. His two-faced form made him instantly recognizable, and Roman artists found numerous ways to depict this unique feature. On coins, which provide our most abundant evidence for Janiform imagery, Janus typically appears as a bearded, mature man with 2 faces in profile, one looking left and one looking right. These faces are usually quite similar, suggesting 2 views of the same person rather than 2 different individuals. The craftsmanship on some of these coins is remarkable, with fine detail visible in the hair, beards, and facial features despite the small scale. Some coins show Janus holding a key in one hand and a staff in the other. The key symbolizes his role as the guardian of gates and doorways, the one who opens and closes, who permits or denies passage. The staff, or scepter, represents his authority and his ancient status as a king or father among the gods. In sculptural reliefs and freestanding statuary, Janus often appears in architectural contexts, as part of gate structures or at entrances to important buildings. These sculptures served both decorative and apotropaic functions, beautifying the space while also invoking the god's protection over the threshold. The 4-faced representations of Janus, while less common, appear in certain special contexts. The most famous example is the Arch of Janus in the Forum Boarium, the cattle market area of Rome. This substantial marble structure, though dating primarily to the 4th century of the Common Era, incorporates earlier traditions of Janiform architecture. It features niches that may have held statues, and its 4-sided form allowed passage in 4 directions, embodying Janus's ability to see and preside over all directions simultaneously. In painting, the evidence is sparser due to the preservation challenges with ancient Roman frescoes. However, the frescoes that do survive from Pompeii and other sites occasionally show Janus, usually in contexts related to doorways or architectural elements. These painted representations often emphasize his solemn, watchful nature, appropriate for a guardian deity. Roman philosophers and intellectuals developed complex interpretations of Janus that went far beyond simple mythology. For them, Janus embodied profound truths about the nature of time, change, and human existence. The Stoic philosophers, whose school was influential in Rome during the late Republic and Empire, saw in Janus a symbol of rational providence. His ability to see past and future represented the divine mind that comprehended all of history simultaneously, understanding cause and effect across the sweep of time. For the Stoics, this made Janus a representation of cosmic order and the rational principle that governed the universe. Marcus Terentius Varro, one of Rome's greatest scholars who lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, provided extensive commentary on Janus in his works on Roman religion. Varro interpreted Janus as representing the world itself, which has no beginning and no end, but exists in perpetual transition. The 2 faces symbolize the heavens and the earth, or alternatively, the world above and the world below. Later, Neoplatonist philosophers developed even more abstract interpretations. They saw in Janus's 2 faces the dual nature of reality, the world of becoming and the world of being, the temporal and the eternal, the material and the spiritual. For these thinkers, Janus represented the liminal state between these realms, the threshold between the physical world and the divine. The concept of liminality, so central to Janus, has fascinated thinkers throughout history. A threshold is neither inside nor outside, neither here nor there. It is a space of possibility, of transformation, of transition from one state to another. Doorways, beginnings, and endings all share this quality of being between states, and Janus's dominion over these liminal spaces made him, in a sense, the god of potentiality itself. Christian writers in late antiquity sometimes attempted to appropriate or reinterpret Janus within their own framework. St. Augustine, writing in the early 5th century, discussed Janus at length in his City of God, though ultimately he rejected the worship of traditional Roman gods. Some Christian interpreters saw in Janus's backward and forward gaze a parallel to the Christian understanding of God's omniscience, though Orthodox Christianity ultimately saw such comparisons as superficial and incompatible with monotheism. Roman literature is rich with references to Janus, from poetry to history to religious texts. These literary sources provide much of our understanding of how the Romans conceived of and related to this god. Ovid's Fasti, composed in the early 1st century of the Common Era, remains our single most important literary source on Janus. The work is structured as a poetic calendar, with each book covering 1 month of the year. The first book, naturally, is dedicated to January and features an extended passage on Janus. In this passage, Ovid presents a dialogue between himself and the god. Janus appears to the poet and explains his nature, his origins, and his functions. He describes how he watches over doorways, how he sees past and future, and how he came to be associated with the beginning of the year. This literary device allows Ovid to present complex theological ideas in an accessible, narrative form. Virgil, in his epic poem The Aeneid, makes several references to Janus, particularly in connection with early Italian history and the legendary origins of Rome. In Book 7, Virgil describes the custom of opening the gates of Janus's temple when war is declared, a passage that has been important for historians trying to understand this Roman practice. The historian Livy, writing in the late 1st century before the Common Era and early 1st century of the Common Era, discusses Janus in the context of early Roman religious practice. His History of Rome provides details about when the gates of Janus's temple were closed, using these closures as markers of periods of peace in Rome's otherwise martial history. Macrobius, a late ancient writer of the 5th century, devoted considerable attention to Janus in his Saturnalia, a dialogue about Roman religion and culture. He records various theories about Janus's nature and origins, preserving information from earlier sources that might otherwise have been lost. The Roman playwright Plautus, who wrote comedies in the 2nd century before the Common Era, occasionally invokes Janus in his plays, usually in contexts involving doorways, departures, or beginnings. These casual references show how deeply embedded Janus was in everyday Roman thought and speech. Later Latin literature, even after the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, continued to reference Janus, though increasingly as a literary allusion rather than an object of active worship. Medieval and Renaissance writers used Janus as a symbol of transition and duality, and this usage has continued into modern literature. The worship of Janus, like all traditional Roman religion, gradually declined with the rise of Christianity in the late Roman Empire. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but was a gradual process spanning several centuries. In the 4th century of the Common Era, as Christianity became first tolerated and then favored by Roman emperors, traditional religious practices began to face restrictions. The Emperor Constantine, who reigned from 306 to 337, while not outlawing pagan worship, clearly favored Christianity and began the process of redirecting imperial patronage away from traditional temples toward Christian churches. The death knell for public worship of the traditional gods came with the Emperor Theodosius I, who reigned from 379 to 395. In a series of edicts issued in the 390s, Theodosius effectively outlawed pagan worship throughout the empire. Temples were closed, sacrifices were forbidden, and the official religious calendar that had honored Janus and the other gods for over 1,000 years was abolished. Yet religious change is never as clean or complete as imperial edicts might suggest. Archaeological evidence indicates that some traditional practices continued, particularly in rural areas and in private contexts, for decades or even centuries after the official prohibition. Small shrines to household gods, including potentially Janus in his role as protector of doorways, may have persisted in hidden or domestic spaces. The month of January retained its name, of course, creating an interesting situation where Christians were marking time using a calendar that still bore the names of pagan deities. Some early Christian authorities were troubled by this, but ultimately pragmatism won out, and the calendar remained largely unchanged. The Temple of Janus in the Roman Forum, along with most traditional temples, was likely closed in the late 4th or early 5th century. What happened to these structures varied. Some were destroyed, their materials repurposed for Christian buildings. Others were converted into churches. Still others simply fell into ruin as maintenance ceased and time took its toll. Interestingly, the symbolic power of Janus persisted even as his worship faded. Medieval and Renaissance writers continued to use Janus as a symbol of looking backward and forward, of wisdom gained from understanding both past and future. In this sense, Janus underwent a transformation from a deity actively worshipped to a cultural symbol and literary device. Although no one actively worships Janus today as the Romans did, his influence and his imagery have persisted in remarkable ways across the centuries and into our contemporary world. The most obvious legacy is the month of January, which retains its ancient name in English and in many other languages derived from Latin. Every year, as January 1st arrives, we unknowingly honor an ancient Roman god, even if we don't think of it in those terms. The association of January with new beginnings, with looking back at the old year and forward to the new, directly echoes the Romans' understanding of Janus. The word janitor, meaning a doorkeeper or caretaker, derives from Janus's association with doors and thresholds. Though a janitor in modern usage has evolved to mean someone who maintains a building, the original sense of guarding the entrance remains embedded in the word's etymology. In literature and art, the image of Janus has become a universal symbol for duality, for the ability to see multiple perspectives, for the tension between past and future. Writers invoke Janus when discussing paradoxes, contradictions, or the need to consider multiple viewpoints simultaneously. The phrase Janus faced has entered the English language, though often with a somewhat negative connotation, suggesting duplicity or two-faced behavior. This usage, while perhaps unfortunate from the perspective of understanding the original meaning of Janus, nonetheless demonstrates the continued cultural power of the image. In psychology, the concept of liminality, which Janus embodied so perfectly, has become an important analytical tool. Psychologists and anthropologists study liminal states, those transitional phases in life or ritual where a person is between identities or statuses. Rites of passage, which mark transitions from childhood to adulthood or from unmarried to married, are examples of liminal experiences that Janus would have recognized. Modern scholars of mythology and religion continue to study Janus as a fascinating example of religious symbolism and its evolution. Comparative mythologists have looked for parallels to Janus in other cultures, finding some interesting analogues in various traditions, threshold deities, and guardian figures, though none quite match the specific Roman conception. In architecture and urban planning, the concept of the threshold as sacred space, which Janus represented, has influenced some modern designers. The entrance to a building is understood not just as a functional necessity, but as a symbolic transition from public to private space, from outside to inside, carrying echoes of ancient Roman thought. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration, it's worth reflecting on what Janus might teach us about our own relationship with time, beginnings, and transitions. The Romans understood that every ending contains a beginning, and every beginning implies an ending. Janus embodied this paradox. When you pass through a doorway, you leave one space and enter another. When one year ends, a new one begins. These are not separate events, but two aspects of the same transition. Our modern lives are full of such transitions, though we may not always recognize them. Each morning is a beginning, each night an ending. Starting a new job, moving to a new home, beginning or ending a relationship. All of these are threshold moments, Janus moments, when we stand between what was and what will be. The Romans believed that such moments required special attention, special reverence. They paused at doorways. They honored the beginning of enterprises. They marked transitions with ritual and awareness. There is perhaps something valuable in this ancient practice, this deliberate acknowledgement of change and transition. Janus's ability to look both backward and forward simultaneously represents a kind of wisdom. Understanding the past helps us make sense of the present and prepare for the future. Yet we must also keep our eyes forward, ready for what comes next. Living fully requires this dual awareness, this Janus-like consciousness of where we've been and where we're going. In our fast-paced modern world, we often rush through transitions without acknowledging them. We move from one thing to the next, from one year to another, without pausing at the threshold. The ancient Roman who stopped at a doorway to acknowledge Janus was doing something we might benefit from, creating a moment of mindfulness, a recognition that something is shifting, changing, beginning or ending. The new year, which the Romans associated so strongly with Janus, is one of the few times when modern culture still observes this kind of threshold awareness. On New Year's Eve, we look back at the year that's ending. On New Year's Day, we look forward to the year beginning. For a brief moment, we become like Janus, two-faced in the best sense, acknowledging both past and future. And so we conclude our journey through the world of Janus, the two-faced god of ancient Rome. We've explored his origins in the earliest layers of Roman religion, his unique position among the gods, his temples and festivals, his representation in art and literature, and his eventual transformation from a deity to a symbol. Janus reminds us that beginnings and endings are sacred moments, deserving of our attention and respect. He teaches us the value of looking both backward and forward, of learning from the past while preparing for the future. He embodies the mysterious nature of time itself, that great river that carries us all from what was to what will be. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine yourself standing at a threshold, a doorway between waking and sleeping, between today and tomorrow. Janus stands there too, in a sense, his two faces calm and watchful. One face looks back at your day, acknowledging all that has been. The other face looks forward towards your rest, toward tomorrow, toward all the beginnings yet to come. You are safe at this threshold. You are held in the ancient rhythms of time, the cycles that Janus understood so well. Days end and begin. Months cycle, years turn. And through it all we pass through countless doorways, literal and metaphorical, each one a tiny transition, a small change, a moment of possibility. Let your breathing slow even more. Feel yourself settling deeper into rest. The story of Janus has been told. The threshold has been crossed. You are passing now from waking into sleep, from one state of consciousness to another, through a doorway as old as humanity itself. And in the morning, when you wake, you will have crossed another threshold, experiencing another beginning, another manifestation of the eternal principle that Janus represented. But for now, simply rest. Simply be here, at peace between one thing and another, held in the gentle transition towards sleep. The two-faced God watches over all beginnings, all endings, all thresholds. And as you begin your journey into sleep, may you find the peace that comes from knowing that every ending leads to a new beginning. Every door that closes reveals another door opening, and all transitions are simply part of the great pattern of time that flows through all things. Rest well, sleep deeply, and when you wake, you will stand once more at a threshold, ready to begin again.